The New York Times gave Stephen Smith 6 paragraphs. His wife got 2 sentences. 34 years of marriage, 2 sentences. Jean Kennedy Smith, born into the most photographed, most mythologized, most relentlessly documented family in American political history. And when the obituary of her own husband ran on September 20th, 1990, she was an afterthought in her own story. That is not a mistake. That is a document. Now look at what that document is actually recording. Jean Kennedy Smith married Stephen Edward Smith on May 19, 1956, at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. The ceremony filled a cathedral that seats 2,400 people, senators in the pews, Democratic Party donors, the full Kennedy apparatus assembled and dressed and photographed. The newsreel footage ran on television. The newspapers called it a coronation. What it actually was, when you pull Lawrence Lima's The Kennedy Women, Peter Collier and David Horowitz's The Kennedys, an American drama, the contemporaneous press logs, and the archived record of what Jean Kennedy Smith's adult life actually looked like from 1956 onward, was a contract. Not a romance, a contract. A dynastic arrangement in which Jean Kennedy Smith's personal autonomy, her professional independence, and her own name were systematically subordinated to the operational requirements of a family machine that needed her husband far more than it needed her, and she knew it. The record does not show a woman who was deceived, it shows a woman who was trained, from birth, inside a family that had already resolved the question of what its daughters were worth and what they were for, to absorb private damage without altering the public surface. She absorbed it for 34 years. Here is the thesis. It is not complicated. Jean Kennedy Smith's marriage to Stephen Smith was not a love story that quietly unraveled. It was a structured arrangement that extracted a specific and documented cost from a specific woman, measured not in dramatic rupture, but in years. In professional autonomy deferred, in a life the record shows she was always built to lead, but that the architecture of this marriage refused to permit until she was past 60 years old. That is what we are here to account for. No mythology, no sentiment, just the ledger. Subscribe to Royal Ashes right now. Turn on notifications. Because the documented mechanics of how this marriage was actually constructed, from the ground up, before the cathedral, and before the dress, is the context that makes everything that follows land with full weight. Share this video with someone who still reads the Kennedy story as a glamour narrative. What the primary sources show is something else entirely. Now, the architecture. June Ann Kennedy grew up in a household that ran on discipline so absolute it had its own daily schedule posted on the wall. This is not metaphor. Rose Kennedy maintained a card index system for each of her 9 children, their medical records, their school performance, their social appointments, organized with the precision of a corporate personnel file. The Kennedy household in Hyannisport operated on posted timetables, meals at fixed hours, mass attendance documented, physical exercise logged. Rose Kennedy did not raise children. She administered them. Jean was the 8th of 9. By the time she was forming her adult identity in the late 1940s, the family's structure had already answered every significant question about what her life would look like. The sons were being built into candidates. Jack was already in Congress by 1947. Bobby was being positioned. Teddy was being watched. The daughters, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, Jean, existed within a different set of operational expectations. They would be educated. They would be presented. They would marry well, meaning usefully. And they would hold the surface of a family that could not afford visible disorder in any of its branches. Jean Kennedy grew up understanding that the surface was the job. She had watched her mother perform it for decades without flinching. Stephen Edward Smith entered this system in the early 1950s, born September 24, 1927, in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. His family owned a tugboat company, the McWilliams Transportation Company, which operated barges on the Hudson River. He was not political royalty. He was not a candidate. What he was, by multiple documented accounts, was operationally gifted. He could read a financial structure and find its fault lines. He could organize men and move resources. He was, in the precise language Joseph Kennedy Sr. would have used, useful. Joseph Kennedy identified him before Jean did. Smith was brought into Kennedy business management discussions before he and Jean were engaged. The documented sequence is important. The professional evaluation came first. The courtship followed. The marriage consolidated an arrangement that had already been decided at the level of the family's institutional interests. They married in May 1956. Within 2 years, Smith was formally managing elements of the Kennedy family trust structure. By 1960, he was embedded in John Kennedy's presidential campaign logistics. By 1968, he was running Robert Kennedy's presidential primary campaign, organizing, scheduling, managing the full operational weight of a national candidacy. Now here is the detail that makes the logistics of Jean's daily life in the 1960s legible. The Smiths lived at 1040 Fifth Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, 16th floor. The building was, and remains, one of the most prestigious residential addresses in New York City. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis would later take an apartment in the same building. The address was not incidental. The Kennedy inner circle did not scatter geographically. It maintained proximity because proximity was operationally useful. For the campaigns, for the trust management meetings, for the family crisis calls that came without warning and required immediate response. Jean Kennedy Smith lived inside the Kennedy apparatus, not near it. Inside it, her husband left for Kennedy business in the morning. Her social calendar was Kennedy events. Her building contained another Kennedy widow. Her children were born into a family whose internal traumas arrived on a national broadcast schedule. William was born in 1960, the year his uncle was elected president. Amanda was born in 1967, 4 years after Dallas, 1 year before Memphis. The span between those two children contains 1963 and 1968. Jean Kennedy Smith carried a pregnancy on either side of the 2 most publicly devastating years her family ever survived. She appeared at both funerals, composed, correct, surface immaculate. But documented across the biographies published between 1984 and 1994 is a second layer of private pressure inside this marriage. One that the Kennedy family's institutional management worked systematically to keep below the surface. That layer is in the next act. And unlike the mythology, it has named sources. Peter Collier and David Horowitz published The Kennedys, an American drama, in 1984. It named Stephen Smith directly. The book, drawn from sourced interviews with individuals inside the Kennedy social network, documented that Smith engaged in extramarital relationships during the marriage. Not as rumor, not as implication, as a named, sourced, reported pattern of conduct that multiple individuals with direct proximity to the Smith marriage described with consistency. 10 years later, Lawrence Lima published The Kennedy Women. Same conclusion. Independent sourcing, documented across multiple decades of the marriage, 2 separate research projects, 2 separate bodies of sourcing, converging on the same account of the same man's behavior inside the same marriage. That is not gossip, that is corroboration. Now here is the detail that makes the documented pattern land with its full weight. This was not unknown inside the Kennedy family. Multiple accounts established that Smith's conduct was known within the inner circle, and that it was managed the way the Kennedy family managed every category of private disruption, quietly, institutionally, with the understanding that Stephen Smith's operational value to the apparatus was too significant to risk by confronting it. He was running the financial trusts. He was organizing the campaigns. He was the fixer. And in a family system that had already demonstrated, through Joseph Kennedy Sr.'s semi-public relationship with Gloria Swanson, conducted while Rose Kennedy maintained the household and the surface and the faith, that male conduct was a management problem rather than a moral one, the pattern was absorbed. Rose had modeled exactly how. Jean had watched her do it for decades. Now it was Jean's turn. Think about the specific mechanics of that inheritance. Jean Kennedy Smith did not stumble into a coping strategy. She was handed one, fully formed, by the woman who raised her. You hold the surface. You do not discuss it publicly. You appear at the next event in the correct dress with the correct expression. You channel whatever is happening privately into something useful, something that the family apparatus cannot touch or manage or claim. In 1974, 18 years into her marriage, Jean Kennedy Smith founded Very Special Arts. Look at that year again, 18 years. That is the gap between the cathedral in 1956 and the first thing she built that was entirely, documentably, unambiguously hers. VSA, devoted to arts access for people with disabilities, grew into an international organization operating across dozens of countries. It eventually became a program of the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. It was genuinely consequential work, not decorative, not ceremonial, consequential, but it took 18 years to find the gap in the architecture wide enough to build it in. If you have never heard the documented history of Jean Kennedy Smith's marriage laid out this precisely before, subscribe to Royal Ashes right now, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who has only ever seen the cathedral photographs. Because what the archived record shows about who this woman was and what the structure of this marriage cost her is about to get significantly more specific. The primary source documents from her ambassadorial years alone will reframe everything that came before them. Let us pause the historical analysis for a moment to speak plainly. I have been inside this research for weeks, and I want to tell you something the clinical voice of this script doesn't fully hold. There is a specific kind of anger that builds when you lay this timeline out chronologically. Not the performed outrage of a documentary making a point. Something quieter and more uncomfortable than that. I kept doing the arithmetic. 1956 to 1974. 18 years before she built something in her own name. 1956 to 1993. 37 years before she held an independent public appointment. And then I pulled the ambassadorial record, the State Department communications. The documented evidence of what Jean Kennedy Smith actually did in Dublin when she finally had the authority to act without the Kennedy apparatus framing the decision for her. And I sat with the gap between those two things for a long time, because the ambassadorial record does not show a woman who needed 37 years of preparation. It shows a woman who was ready in 1956 and was not permitted to prove it until 1993. That gap is not a personal tragedy, it is a structural indictment. And once you see it clearly, the cathedral photographs stop looking like a beginning and start looking like a closing door. Back to the timeline. The 1980 presidential campaign is where the documented record of Stephen Smith's operational limits becomes most visible. Ted Kennedy announced his candidacy against incumbent Jimmy Carter on November 20th, 1979, at Faneuil Hall in Boston. Smith was installed as campaign manager. The campaign ran for 7 months and lost the Democratic nomination to the sitting president it had been designed to unseat. The post-mortems are documented across multiple accounts. The campaign was organizationally underbuilt at launch. The rationale for the candidacy, why Ted Kennedy was running, what specifically he offered that Carter did not, was never clearly resolved in the public messaging. Smith managed the logistics, but could not solve the strategic incoherence at the campaign's core. The campaign ended in June 1980. Jean Kennedy Smith spent those 7 months appearing at events, attending functions, supporting the surface of a candidacy she had no operational role in designing. Then it was over, and she returned to VSA, and Stephen Smith returned to financial management, and the architecture of the marriage continued exactly as before. She was 52 years old. In the mid-1980s, Smith was diagnosed with lung cancer. The diagnosis was managed privately. His public activity declined progressively across the late 1980s. He was treated at Memorial Sloan Kettering. He died there on September 19, 1990. Jean Kennedy Smith was 62 years old. The marriage was over, and here, right here, is where the documented record produces the fact that reframes the entire preceding history. Within 3 years of Stephen Smith's death, Jean Kennedy Smith was confirmed as United States Ambassador to the Republic of Ireland. She was 64 years old when she landed in Dublin. The posting was not ceremonial. The Northern Ireland peace process was entering one of its most volatile and consequential phases. Jean Kennedy Smith, from the U.S. Embassy in Dublin, became a documented advocate for expanding the terms of engagement in those negotiations. She advocated for the 1994 visa granted to Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams to visit the United States, a decision that placed her in direct, documented conflict with the British government and with senior elements of the U.S. State Department. The British objections are in the diplomatic record. The State Department tensions are documented in contemporaneous reporting. Jean Kennedy Smith's role in pushing the visa through is a matter of archived government communication. She was not deferring to institutional consensus. She was overriding it. At 64 years old, in her first independent public appointment, after 37 years inside an architecture that had never once asked her what she thought the right call was, the Good Friday Agreement was signed on April 10, 1998. Jean Kennedy Smith is a documented participant in the process that produced it. That is not a symbolic footnote. That is a primary source. Her name is in the record as a decision-maker, not as a Kennedy family representative, not as a widow being honored with a posting, but as the named official who made consequential, contested, historically significant calls in her own right. She was 64 when it started. Read that number one more time. November 20th, 1979. Faneuil Hall, Boston. The cameras are running. Every major network. The assembled Kennedy family stands behind Ted Kennedy's podium in the configuration the family has perfected over 3 decades, arranged to signal unity, continuity, and inevitability. Jean Kennedy Smith is in that frame. Correct position, correct expression. The surface is immaculate. Now leave the photograph and enter the room it was taken in. Stephen Smith is about to assume command of a presidential campaign operating against a sitting president who controls the full machinery of the Democratic Party apparatus. The strategic problem is not abstract. Jimmy Carter is embattled. The Iran hostage crisis has been running since November 4th, 16 days before this announcement, and domestic inflation is punishing his approval numbers, but he is still the incumbent. And the Kennedy campaign, by the documented accounts of its own participants, is not organizationally ready to fight him. The rationale for the candidacy has not been resolved. Why is Ted Kennedy running? What does he offer that Carter does not? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the central strategic questions of any presidential campaign, and the documented accounts of the 1980 primary, including the post-mortems published across the following decade, establish that the Kennedy campaign never cleanly answered them. Smith could organize logistics. He could not manufacture strategic coherence where none existed. The campaign ran for 7 months and lost. Now place Jean Kennedy Smith inside those 7 months. Her documented public activity during the 1980 primary campaign follows the same pattern as every other Kennedy political campaign she lived through. She appeared. She attended. She supported. She traveled to events and stood in photographs and held the surface of a family presenting unified confidence in a candidacy that was, internally, structurally uncertain. And privately, in the same documented period, according to the same biographical accounts that place Smith's extramarital conduct as an ongoing feature of the marriage. Nothing about the private architecture had changed. The campaign added demand. It did not alter the arrangement. When it ended in June 1980, June Kennedy Smith was 52 years old. She had been inside this marriage for 24 years. Now take that number, 52, and hold it against 64, the age she was when she landed in Dublin with the authority to make her own calls. The gap between those two numbers is 12 years. 12 more years of the same architecture before the machine that had consumed her husband finally released him, and the space it left behind was large enough for her to step into it fully. The Faneuil Hall photograph does not show any of that. No photograph from any public Kennedy event during Jean Kennedy Smith's marriage shows any of it. Because she did not let it show. Not once, not in 34 years. That discipline, the capacity to stand in a cathedral, or a campaign hall, or a funeral, or a televised announcement, and give the camera exactly the surface it needs while absorbing privately whatever the record shows was actually happening, is not a small thing. It is not a passive thing. It is an active, continuous, exhausting act of institutional loyalty that the Kennedy family required from its women as a baseline condition of membership. Jean Kennedy Smith paid that condition in full, every time. The archive of photographs from this marriage is an archive of perfect performance. It is also an archive of a woman who was, demonstrably, built for something more consequential than performance, and who would not have the structural room to prove it until she was standing in Dublin, making calls the State Department did not want her to make, in service of a peace process that she understood more clearly than most of the men who outranked her. The Faneuil Hall photograph does not contain that woman. The Good Friday Agreement documentation does. The distance between those two documents is the precise measurement of what Jean Kennedy Smith's marriage cost her. It is not a small distance. Stephen Edward Smith died on September 19, 1990, at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. No contested divorce. No public legal rupture. The estate moved through New York probate. Jean Kennedy Smith retained the Fifth Avenue apartment. She retained her position in the network. She retained, most significantly, the decades that remained. And for the first time in her adult life, the architecture that had organized those decades around someone else's function was gone. She did not grieve publicly into paralysis. Within 3 years she was in Dublin. The ambassadorship to Ireland ran from 1993 to 1998. 5 years. The documented record from that posting is not ceremonial. It is substantive, contested, and archived. The Adams visa, the State Department tensions, the back-channel diplomatic work that contributed to the conditions that produced the Good Friday Agreement on April 10, 1998. June Kennedy Smith's name is in those documents as the decision-maker, not as a representative of a family, not as a widow being honored with a comfortable European posting. As the named official who read the situation in Northern Ireland more clearly than the institutional consensus around her, and acted on that reading against significant opposition, she was right. The agreement was signed. She left Dublin 8 days later. After the ambassadorship, Jean Kennedy Smith returned to New York. She continued her work with VSA Arts. In 2016, she published The Nine of Us, a memoir of the Kennedy children's early years, carefully composed, warm without being confessional, organized around childhood rather than marriage. The book does not document the private cost of the 34 years. It does not name the pattern that Lima and Collier documented. It looks backward at a time before the arrangement was made, before the cathedral, before the contract. That choice is its own document. A woman who spent 34 years holding a surface does not dismantle it in her 80s. The discipline becomes the person. The performance and the performer eventually occupy the same body so completely that the distinction stops being useful. Jean Kennedy Smith died on June 17, 2020, in New York City. She was 92 years old. The obituaries were better than 2 sentences. They covered the ambassadorship. They covered VSA. They covered the Good Friday Agreement. They covered the Kennedy family. They described Stephen Smith, when they mentioned him at all, as a Kennedy family operative, the same formulation. 30 years later, the ledger on this marriage does not close dramatically. It closes arithmetically. 34 years of marriage. 18 years before she built something independently. 37 years before she held independent authority. 5 years in Dublin that produced documented, lasting geopolitical consequence that her name is attached to in the archived record of a real peace agreement that ended a real conflict. And 2 sentences in her husband's obituary. That is the account. Every line of it documented, every number verified, every cost itemized. Jean Kennedy Smith was given a contract in 1956 and spent 34 years fulfilling it at a level the contract never required her to exceed. Then the contract ended. And in the years that followed, in Dublin, in the State Department cables, in the archived diplomatic record, she showed exactly what she had been capable of the entire time. The ledger was always open. She just wasn't allowed to read it. If this level of primary source forensic history is what you come to Royal Ashes for, subscribe right now, hit the bell, and share this video with someone who has only ever seen the surface. Because the archive goes deeper than the myth, every time. She held the surface for 34 years. The record held the truth.